Hello, hello. Hello, LinkedIn. Hello, YouTube. Hello to all our friends out there. So sorry for the technical glitch on my end. I see some people were asking if we were live. We're human, and that's the beautiful thing. It is the start of National Disability Employment Awareness Month, so I brought two fantastic guests on today. Hello to Alycia.
Hello, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. And hello to Brian.
Hello, happy Wednesday. So glad to be here.
Yes, we're thrilled to have you as well. For our audience, as I'm looking off screen a little bit as we're chatting in the chat, Alycia is a soon-to-be well-known TEDx speaker and coach on disability and ability and all things in that space. We are super excited to talk to her today. She's a well-known coach and speaker. And we also have Brian McComak, a diversity and inclusion consultant, speaker, and author, and facilitator of over 20 years of experience in D&I. Wave hello to the fans.
Hi. Oh, and I have a book coming out. Did I mention that?
It will be your second book, is my understanding. And yes, we will cover a bit of that. And Alycia, I hear you're having a TEDx talk that will be going live maybe shortly.
It was released this week. It's live. It's called Disabling Ableism, the Modern Pathway to Inclusion.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing. I'm super thrilled to hear about that, to spread your voice in audio and video. And Brian, obviously in the written format, we want to celebrate both of you and your hard work.
Thank you. Absolutely. And Alycia, we'll make sure we share that TEDx talk in the next Hummingbird Humanity newsletter. So
thank you.
We have to share the messages and amplify the voices. So congrats on that. That's super exciting.
Thank you so much. It's been a fun week.
Oh my goodness. Well, the week is only half over, but for everyone who's watching this on reruns, I don't know where we are in your week, but we're going to make it the best week we can. My focus this week is celebrating the contributions of Americans with disabilities in our country's workforce, both visible and invisible disabilities. And I thought that I love the ping pong effect of these conversations. Maybe we can start with a little bit of introduction and backgrounds. And I'd like to turn it over to you, Alycia, to share a little bit about your story for those of us who can only see you here.
Okay. My name's Alycia, and I was born with my disability, and I live my life in my wheelchair. It's called sacral agenesis, which is just basically underdevelopment of my spinal cord. I was also born an identical twin to an able-bodied sister, so I've been on this sort of inclusion journey, literally since the cell split into two. And, I was born back in the 70s when the disability rights movement was really kicking off. So I've been on this progression, this journey of inclusion, almost as an experiment most of my life. And so, I've got a lot of background, especially from, societal and moving into the workplace. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to share my journey and hopefully widen the doors for people that might follow me.
What a great framing, widening the doors. There's so many doors, obviously, through your lived experience. They are literal. Thank you for joining again today. And Brian, would you share a little bit about your background and perhaps just for the audience, a little bit about your disability?
Sure. Well, again, thanks for having me, Michael and Alycia. It's wonderful to share this virtual stage with you, and just glad to be here. I've mentioned Hummingbird Humanity. I founded a consulting firm about a year and a half ago, Hummingbird Humanity, which focuses on bringing to life human-centered workplace cultures. And that is that the work we do is really grounded in my career as an HR professional and as a diversity and inclusion professional, who have found some workplaces where I felt like I fit, and many where I just felt like I didn't quite fit in. And I also felt like I couldn't assimilate. It just was too hard for me to meet those rules, that often invisible rules of how I was expected to show up. And And so now I'm trying to bring to life those workplaces that allow for all of us to be authentically and beautifully who we are, and who you are, for those of you watching and listening. A little bit about me. So you might have guessed if you're watching, which you likely are, that I'm a white cisgender man. Those facts are true and correct. I'm also gay. And which is not a disability. Let's make sure we're super clear about that. It is just who I am, and I love who I am. As happens a lot in the queer community, I also battle mental health or mental illness issues. And I know we're going to talk about which language we want to use in that later in the conversation. So I've battled anxiety and depression over much of my adult life, and I've had more than one episode where depression has really just taken me out of the game, and has affected work. And so I think those intersections are things that we can talk about. And I'm also sober. So sobriety is an important part of my journey.
Brian, thank you for sharing that so openly and transparently. I think that you've already started to expose something that is in my personal, in my thoughts, which has a lot to do with the comfort that people have in expressing their disability. When the two of us were chatting a little bit earlier last week, we were talking about, in essence, that designation of disability and a sense of ownership or perhaps avoidance that may occur. Alycia, I'd like to start with you because you shared already a little bit about your very visible disabilities. And I was curious if you could share, what does it feel like to, in essence, embrace that designation? What does it look like from your end, and also perhaps how others are defining it?
From my end, it's empowering to really own up to every piece of me. But that has not been something that was easily done. It's taken a lot of time to learn about the power that comes with the disability and the things the gifts that it gives me in my life to leverage and give to the world, the society, workplace, and such. And, disability is stigmatized in our society. So from a personal level, it takes a long time, at least it did for me. It took most of my life for me to understand that, frankly, the ableist, thoughts that you would be so much better if you were not that, to strip those away and understand that the disability is frankly a huge part of each one of our individualities, those who have some type of disability, visible or not. So owning it is freeing. It's liberating. It allows you to exercise all kinds of muscles that help elevate your life. If you're willing to own it and understand that it is a major part of your being.
I'm on mute because
I lost sound again.
I'm on mute because I'm that guy. Sorry, New York City construction. Occasionally I mute. Alycia, thank you for sharing. Not funny, but
we're here to help. We're here to help.
Yes. Thank you for sharing a little bit about just your sense of ownership, because I've seen, especially in the last 18 months, a lot of people trying to own their realities. Obviously, some others don't want to face their realities in different ways. Brian, you shared obviously the huge amount of intersectionality of your life. Where and how did you find a sense of ownership in your journey? And how did you come to that moment? Was there a breaking moment of owning it?
Yeah. It's such a good question. Well, and I'll say that I think it's also an ongoing journey. So yes, there are those aha moments that have happened, and I'll share a couple of those, but it is an ongoing journey. For example, one of the ways I think about it is there were times and many years where when I would share with select individuals or groups, it was because I needed help and support. And certainly I still need help and support. I have systems, therapy is a big one. I have 12-step community. So I have those systems and support structures that exist today. And so now when I choose to share, it's how can I share and to be in service of others and to make a difference and to raise awareness about a conversation, as Alycia shared, that has so much stigma of, I'm a big believer that we can take away power from those things that we bring to the light. Darkness can't live in the light. So that's one of the ways I think about it. One of the milestone moments for me, though, was as I stepped into work as a diversity and inclusion professional, I had to learn and really challenge myself about how do I leverage my identities, my stories, my experiences to do this work, to benefit, to advocate for others, to make the world a better place for everyone, particularly those in marginalized and oppressed communities. And so one of the ways that we do that is by being counted. So in HR systems around the globe, we capture demographic information, and we know that that employees are very unlikely to identify as being a person with a disability when they complete that box on their the application process. And I was one of those people. I would say I'm not a person with a disability. And then I said, as I was thinking about this, I'm like, well, if I'm not owning my identity and acknowledging that's part of me, how am I part of the change that needs to happen? What does that look like? And I said, I need to own this identity. Mm-hmm. And so now I do check the box as yes, because I am a person with a disability. I think the other moment, and this has been multiple moments, is when I've had the opportunity to be on a stage and share that I battle anxiety and depression, or share that I'm a person in the 12-step recovery community. It's really rewarding, and I'm grateful for the reality that after those times I'm on stage, I always get messages from people who were in the audience who say, thank you for saying that on stage. Mm-hmm. I've not been able to share that with other people in my life or with my coworkers, and everyone has to come to that journey of when they share and who they share with on their own terms. That's what's right for one person is not necessarily right for the next. But I'm just grateful that I can be for those individuals someone who has shown that it's okay to share that part of who you are.
Yeah, there's something as an observer that I find very admirable and almost powerful of owning the whole of who you are. I'm not a huge fan of those who use language like, it's so brave of you. It's not for me, it's not necessarily about bravery. It's just about ownership. But perhaps either of you feel a little differently. Is it brave to own your disability in whatever form or fashion?
I personally think the word brave or you're so inspiring or any terms like that, it goes, again, it's the ableist thinking in our society, in that ableism, what is it? It's a discrimination or social prejudice where we, consider a typical body being superior over a disabled, situation. And we don't need to look at disability like, wow, you're so brave to live like that. Wow, I could never do that. It's shifting that stigma in that this is just who I am. This is how I live. And it isn't something that we need to change or shift or be proud of. It's a part of the human being, just like the color of our skin, whether we're male or female, and all of these things that we're talking about in the diversity conversation. It needs to be opened up, and we need to have courage and bravery to start sharing with each other and having conversations about it instead of looking over or through a person with a disability because we're afraid to talk about it. We're afraid to have the discussion. We're afraid to have human to human interactions so we learn about one another and we can understand it better.
I love that. And I fully 100% agree with what Alycia said. I'm going to offer a slightly different perspective in a specific context of, I think, as Alycia talked about, just the things that are come with me are just who I are part of who I am and how I show up in the world. And the work that I've done to manage my mental health actually influences how I show up. And so it's just part of me. And I don't spend any energy wishing that I didn't have these things, because by the way, they just are. What I do get though is, and I hope that the change that Alycia was referring to, which I think was framed in the context of just how we live together and exist together as humans, I hope that that can also enter our workplaces. Mm-hmm. And what I do honor is that in some workplaces that it is courageous or brave to tell your story, because not every workplace has yet reached the point where they're going to let humans just be humans. So I do want to honor those individuals who take those steps and say, I'm going to take the risk here. And that risk is hopefully opening the door and making things easier for the next person. So we can reach that point of, we're just all humans who all come with our own stuff, and our own, things that are great about us, and the things that are challenging, and the things that are difficult, and our quirks and our passions. And then how do we just all come together in those workplaces?
And I absolutely agree with that. And I also think the employer needs to be brave and not be so worried about punitive issues, and be brave, being open to those conversations. Because I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting with an HR department where they're just like, oh, we can't say that word. Shh. There's lots of shushing. And from a bravery standpoint with our language, I do 100% agree that we both, like, it's collaborative. Both sides need to be a little braver in that communication, for sure. I agree.
Oh my gosh, I've been one of those. Sorry, Michael, I just have to say this. I have been that HR person, so I will own that and acknowledge, and as I've done the work that I get to do today to become the diversity and professional I am, I've learned, oh my gosh, those fears that we're guided by in HR aren't helpful, and they certainly do not serve humans well.
Well, and it's also part of, in essence, the corporate culture, where there's I won't call it normal, but a norm, an average of what people may look like, how they may act, how they may show up. There's this expectation that it's safer to gravitate towards the norm, whether that is a cisgender straight white man, and that's the way the majority of our sales team may show up. They all play a sport, so you gravitate towards that space. And when people break away from that and may express an interest in art, or that their spouse is someone of the same sex, it's seen as somehow brave. I think that the effort to normalize those conversations and show more dimensions of diversity is extremely powerful. But I do want to circle back to maybe just we can touch on this. There's a bit of contrast. Brian, you shared that you've been in HR for a long time. And Alycia, obviously, you have your own lived experience. Can we talk for a moment about the word disabled? How HR has talked about able, and they, don't want people to speak in that language. And Alycia, as someone who's in the community, maybe not representational, but in the community, is it okay to talk about disabled, differently abled, ableism? Is there more preferred language?
So language is important, obviously, but I am from the camp that I don't believe language should stop us from progression. I do get asked a lot. I refer myself as disabled and able, differently able. There's a lot of terms, and over time these terms change. So from a disability perspective, if you're talking to somebody in the disability community, a lot of the times they're going to say, no need to be making these shifts. We're all good. We just need to move forward and have the conversations. So I think some of these terms make able-bodied people feel better about addressing somebody with a disability, such as differently abled. They spin that as a more positive term. Either way, for me, we got to get past the terms and get to the meat of the conversation, so we understand each other. So that's sort of the standpoint that I come from.
Appreciate it, Brian.
Yeah. I'm going to offer 3 quick thoughts here. So first of all, what I often suggest or try to suggest as often as I can is to put the person before the disability. So when we're suggesting to organizations, the language used is it's a person with a disability, not a disabled person, because that we're humans first, and disability is part of who we are. The second is that 100% with what Alycia said is that language is important and language is evolving. And what's most important when you're talking to a person is what language works for that person, and that you're clear on how you talk about a community versus an individual, as when you're thinking about an organizational construct. So I say persons with a disability, but there may be a person in your organization who wants to be considered differently abled, and that's okay. That is, they get to be identify however they want to identify, what feels right for them. The last thing I just want to mention is about another just twist on this whole conversation that I think what happens in corporate environments is I'm so glad that the Americans with Disabilities Act exists, because it raises awareness and it raises the expectation that organizations meet the needs of people with disabilities in their workplaces. I wish it wasn't necessary, because I wish it was just the way that it worked. What happens, though, I think too much is that HR teams and legal teams, again, I've been this person before, focus too much on risk and compliance. And when you focus on risk and compliance, you focus on what can't be done or what might go wrong. And I'm not saying that those things aren't important, because certainly we have to be responsible in how we manage our organizations. But I really just encourage and challenge us to say, let's talk about what's possible, what could go right. How do we find the solution? What are we missing that we can bring to life and bring to the forefront? So if we can shift away from risk and compliance to possibility, I think when we're talking about these communities, and the language triggers this risk and fear versus potential and possibility, and let's get to that place.
And start in that place, honestly, in believing impossible before it's a no, it's a yes before it's a no.
Yes.
I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, I think that we're, at least the 3 of us, so therefore it's a quorum and it's official. We all see that idea of framing it in the positive, in essence, creating a safe space where it can be talked about, mitigating the risk by acknowledging there may be a risk, but not worrying about it, is really important. And it leads to, I guess, both of you are in many ways coaches. Alycia, you are literally a coach. Brian, you coach leaders and teams all the time. So I'd like to start with Alycia. Alycia, how do you coach leaders to create safe spaces for people with visible and invisible disabilities?
So the first thing is we have to understand that this is not a check off the box conversation, that this is going to be like ongoing, continual, hard collective exploration and work that we have to adapt to with each individual person. And to create safe spaces, we need to have, a space where people are feeling respected. They're feeling they have a seat at the table. They're feeling heard, where they're not put in this box of boundaries that they must stay in, that conversation is there to be had, and that we just understand that we have to have these conversations to start learning from one another. And as leaders, we need to potentially not be so worried about the bottom line, but start understanding that if we're not including in the process and we're not hearing everyone's voice, that we're not putting ourselves from a business standpoint in a position to reach our fullest potential in all aspects of the business, is where I would start.
That's an appreciated point. Brian, you have some thoughts behind those eyes. I know you well enough.
I never have anything that's going on in this little mind up here. It's yes, there's always things spinning around. One of the activities that I like to lead is centered around the human iceberg, which for those of you who have not seen the human iceberg model, you can just click in Google and just write human iceberg and you'll see what I'm talking about. And the human iceberg is a way to think about the things that are visible or above the waterline, and those are things that are invisible and below the waterline. And we're all a collection of identities and experiences. And what the activity we do, or that I like to lead, and we do this at Hummingbird as well, is with organizations and teams, is who am I? And so we encourage people, teams to come together and just share their stories. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the best ways for leaders, sort of back to your core question, to create a safe space for people to share about who they are, is for those leaders to share their own stories. Mm-hmm. And share what's important to them, what drives their humanity. And those stories, what I have found every time, those stories are powerful, and they drive connection, and they drive trust, and they create safe spaces that allow humans to be humans. I think workplaces have taught us for so many years to leave emotion and leave those stories outside the four walls when you walk in the door. And I'm like, but we're humans who walked in those doors. We can't like just take that. We can't take off that experience. We can't take off that emotion. It's not a coat. It's just part of who we are. So let's allow those stories to be part of how we interact with each other.
Well, and for 14% of at least Americans, they're not currently walking through any doors. The white collar workforce is fortunate enough, perhaps, to currently work from home. I don't know if that's fortunate. It seems like that for many. But you just brought up something else, Brian. I'm going to lead in with you about what do you see as the impact of not having supportive policies for people with visible and invisible disabilities?
So I think that I'm going to take it from this perspective of what I think gets lost. So I believe that for companies, organizations, teams, whatever level you want to look at, that you drive more success, you create more potential for success. Or for those business leaders who are listening and watching, there's a return on investment for creating spaces where humans thrive. So if you aren't creating spaces where people with disabilities thrive and feel included and feel seen and feel valued, then you've missed out on the potential of the value they bring. The ideas they bring, the experiences they bring, and that goes for any community. But when one of the members of the disability community that I love is Mindy Shire. Mindy Shire is the founder of Runway of Dreams, and she looks to put people with disabilities on the runway, which is such a phenomenal cause, and they do some great work. So check them out. And something I remember hearing from her, which I know is a mantra within the community, is not for us, without us. Mm-hmm. And so that's important. So when you're designing for the community, include them. The other part of it, that I've heard from her, is if you want someone to be innovative and have to solve a problem, bring a person with a disability to the room, because they've been hacking the world their entire lives. Alycia, I have no doubt that is true for you, because the world wasn't designed for a person in a wheelchair.
Yeah, and I can actually share a quick personal story with that through my career. Through the hiring process has always been one of the biggest challenges for me that's been super uncomfortable. But as we progress in our society, it has gotten a little bit better. And my last company literally hired me. He didn't know I was showing up in a wheelchair to my interview, didn't flinch. There wasn't a conversation about it. And he ended up hiring me. And later, I start doing these motivational speaking, inclusion at work. And I asked him, why did you hire me? You didn't flinch about my disability. And he said, one, for all of your experience and education and expertise and blah, blah, blah. But two, I knew you had to be a good planner. I know that you have to plan accessibility, get to the airport, go to different client offices, plan before you even do your job. And he knew that would translate to my work. And that is taking the disability and understanding whatever our differences are, disability or not, we are overcoming something in our individual lives that makes us competitively an advantage over someone else if you can look at that thing instead of it being a limitation, but rather an expertise, something that's going to accelerate and bring in something new to your organization that isn't in this box that we think needs to be, the standard situation. And so leveraging disability or any of our differences as an asset to progress business and society is the way that we look at it. And we all have something that we're better or that we've had to overcome that we're, and it's exactly the story that you're saying, Brian. So,
well, and I really appreciate you sharing that narrative. Coming from the advertising and marketing space, there are legendary stories of plenty of rooms filled with men who are trying to solve a problem or sell a product to a woman. And it was groundbreaking to bring a woman into the conversation to say, like, we don't think laundry detergent is sexy. Why are you selling it that way to this audience? And it, at the time, was like, no, you don't understand. This is the way women think. And the response I would conject is, quote, I'm a woman. I think I know how we think, but thank you. Like mansplaining probably came from that magical moment. But there's something to appreciating, and I relish it, Alycia. In essence, your manager, your boss, saw that your perspective on life and your lived experience would bring a dimension to the work that they didn't have prior to your starting. And that's a beautiful thing. When a room is filled with people with diverse thought, diverse experiences, you'll solve a problem in a different way. There's not that same speak, same think. So there's, I especially believe that during National Disability Employment Awareness Month, it is a mouthful. It is important to understand how those disabilities show up in the workspace. Letting people say that they have a tough day can be important, but also what does a tough day look like for them may be very different from someone else who's just like, I spilled my coffee on my white shirt. Like, I've got real things I'm dealing with today. And it's not an ideal day. Or there's a circumstance at work that has put me off because someone said something or expressed something that is not respecting me. So there's an element of creating those safe spaces and listening and honoring your employees that I think is invaluable. Is there a way, perhaps, I'll turn it to either of you, to create those safe spaces for conversations? Alycia, you said, we just need to have the conversation. But how do you create that space in the moment?
For me, you just approach, it's as simple as approaching a human being and saying, tell me about you. Like, let's just open up a conversation. Like, I started speaking because I've been excused, like overlooked, looked past, looked through, no matter what I accomplish. It's just like, so we need to just say, like, tell me about you. And then the conversations start. I mean, for me, it is that bare bones simple. And then we get into all of the other steps of the process, but we're missing that first. It's like a fear. It's a blocker. And then we're making assumptions about people because we're not having conversations. And the problem is we're making false assumptions, and it's perpetuating the problem through eternity. We need to just say, like, hey, tell me about you.
Thank you. Brian, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, I want to share a short story that really I think amplifies what you've just mentioned. Is one of the risks or challenges is it's been 12 years ago. I received a medical diagnosis that was life altering, and it sparked a deep depression. And now I'm what we would call someone who's lived with functional depression. So when I say it takes me out of the game, it takes me out of the game in my mind and my ability to show up in a way that is true to who I typically am. I still show up physically though. So I kept going to work, but I couldn't think and do and process all the things that I needed to do in my job. And my coworkers saw it. Like they're aware of that something happened. What they experienced was Brian's not doing his job anymore. And what I experience is I feel like I can't do my job, and I feel like my job is now at risk. And they're like, they're frustrated with me, and I'm frustrated with me. And then, and it's a cycle that just spirals downward. And, when I think back to that time, I wish that I had felt like I could talk about what was happening. And I'm not saying that they did anything that said to me that I couldn't talk about it, right? There weren't messages of don't be human, or don't have depression. There wasn't any message though that said I can be open about what's happening. And when I think back to the humans I was working with at that time, they're humans who would have been, I believe, supportive and understanding, and would have said, Brian, maybe you need to take some time off work. Maybe there are services, or maybe you can call our EAP, and so on. And I think you create that environment by you can't. It's hard to create the environment at the moment it happens. By the time I hit that depression, it was too late for anyone to really make that happen. Although you can still try to open the door, the environment needs to be led by an openness and an honoring the humanity that we all bring with us. That there are small life moments, and there are big life moments, and there's everything in between. And while we do need to get to work and to get our jobs done and be professional and all the things, we also are still human along the way. So let's have grace and understanding and allow for real dialogue.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian. It's disheartening to hear that the environment you were in didn't create enough of a space that you could share openly. Again, it was not a slight to those people who were probably very human. And as a representative of an organization that coaches leaders to be more human, to understand their teammates. And yes, it's important to understand what we as a group may need to achieve today on the journey to succeed this quarter or this year. But if you don't take those moments to talk to people as people, you're going to miss out first and foremost. But you're also creating an environment where the expectation is you live in a narrow space. You have to show up in a narrow way rather than, how's your family at home? Like even asking a simple question like that. Or I noticed on Zoom that you have a dog. How'd you have a dog? Like, what was that story? Because there may unfold and unfurl a story that now allows you to understand that other person as a person and as a human being. It's interesting. I asked in the chat, and I'm debating whether I share some of these, if people have expressed their disabilities or what their lives are like with disabilities. And a woman, Kara from North Carolina, shared very openly about being dyslexic and a cancer survivor, and her life with a younger brother with cerebral palsy, and what that life is a little bit like. It's invaluable for people to show up as their full selves, because for me, at least, when I hear someone has an experience that may be in some ways relatable, whether it's because I know someone like them, it creates a bridge. We don't need to have that same, like for Brian and I, great, we're out gay men. And I could, try to make the analogy that, well, when I was coming out, but that's not a disability. But those moments of me living my life have given others the space to live their lives. I can recall a young man speaking about that to me. It's like, what's it like being a leader who's out? You don't this young man was like 23, 22, and probably had never seen someone like me before. And so there's some power to that. And I think when it comes to disability, it plays a role as well.
Well, and I think also us understanding that disability isn't this rare thing. It's 1 in 4 of us will experience it at some point in our life, whether it's a broken leg moment in time for forever, like me, or any time in between, aging, illness, countless other things. And so looking at it as something that literally is fluid in a lot of our lives, we can relate to it. That's why I'm sure that's why we speak on this, because when I go speak, there's always somebody many that can relate. And then we're starting to practice these conversations and it becomes more normal. And then it becomes normal to talk about this stuff, you know? So that's the point.
Yeah. And you sparked for me a reminder of, one of my favorite phrases, which both Alycia and Michael will know, and it's not new to probably anyone in the room, which is representation matters. And I think back, I do think there is a parallel, even though being gay is not a disability, it is an invisible identity, as are my disabilities. And what stories we choose to share or what stories we choose to keep hidden tells a story as well. And if you have a leader or leaders in your company who are sharing their stories, whether it's they have a disability identity or whether they have a conversation to share about sexual orientation or gender identity or so many other of those invisible stories, or being about sobriety and recovery community, those examples from leadership that it's okay to be a human, and it's okay to be a human who has stories and identities and lived experiences. By the way, it's true for all of us, so it is okay. But for some reason, we've all bought into this corporate environment mandate that we don't tell those stories here. Those stories need to stay hidden. And I think about even senior leaders that I've worked with who are out gay individuals, and who are also people who learned to edit any references anytime they're in front of a room of people, because that's what the world they grew up in. That is, that story, while different, is also the same in some ways for invisible disabilities, particularly.
100%. And I think that's part of the problem is disability is part of the inclusion, diversity, equity conversation. It's just not always included. And we need to get used to that. It's the same conversation. It's just a different identity, and including it, getting used to including it is going to be a huge component into normalizing.
Yeah. There's just part of the conversation that I think can be uncomfortable for some, but by normalizing it, it doesn't make it comfortable. It just makes it conversation. And I would be remiss if I did not make sure to talk a little bit about the pandemic in this conversation. And because so many people have been isolated due to the pandemic. I even learned from those who were in manufacturing, sure, we shut our plant down for 10 days. We struggled through it. But there was that sense that some people in the organization were going to be isolated. I spoke to an individual who's, yes, their manufacturing plant stayed up, and they had others who were in the biosciences who had to be kept safe. So everyone else had to stay away. So they were very aware that they had to remain isolated so others could continue to do their job. But I am curious, in the isolation many people experienced during the pandemic, what should companies do more of to support mental well-being?
Well, something that I want to acknowledge here, and is just to build on something that Alycia just shared, is the introvert-extrovert dynamic is also part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation. When I think about how do we invite people to the conversation and ensure there's space for voices for everyone, introverts are more likely to sort of sit back and listen. And if you don't invite them or give space for them to join the conversation, you might miss something that's really awesome. So, there's all these levels. Again, introversion, extroversion is not a disability. But when I think about this stay-at-home reality that so many, or quarantine reality that so many of us have been faced with, and all the impacts of the pandemic, for introverts, when I hear from many of my friends who are introverts, they're like, "This is brilliant. I love this." And for extroverts like me, particularly an extrovert who battles anxiety and depression, who one of my triggers is feeling lonely. So being alone all the time, every day for weeks on end, it was really hard for me. And that human connection was something I was missing. So, when I think about what companies can do, I think, first of all, I'm excited about what's possible for the evolution of how we think about flexible working, and how allowing for any number of ways for employees to work, whether it's in the office or working remotely or working at hours that are non-traditional hours, because there are some individuals with invisible disabilities that mornings can be challenging for them in a very real way. So there's all of these things that come to play, and what I'm hopeful for is that we really embrace the potential of redefining the workplace in a way that works for humans and works for humans with disabilities. When I think, one of the conversations I've had many times with clients is, as we're thinking about in this environment where there is an emerging new war for talent, or maybe it's already here, and the community of people with disabilities has been often left out of the consideration, and we have not created opportunities for them. When I think about the buildings and accesses are built for able-bodied individuals like myself, well, now we have a way to, we always have this way, let's acknowledge that, but we can't change the past, we can only do what we're here today. And now we have a way to make sure that they're included. So how do you engage a whole new community of talent that we haven't included before?
I love that. And when I think about isolation, people with disabilities have been isolated through history. So we need to be thinking about adaptability, being open to that, being nimble, and understanding that for people with disabilities, visible or not, there's no inclusion without access. And we need to be open to adapt to that and not fear it, and understand that laws that are in place to help with those things like ADA, those aren't things that we need to fear. They're things that we need to look at as like our freedoms that give us the opportunity to access life as we change and grow over time. It's for all of us, again, 1 in 4 of us, and to leverage those things as beautiful opportunities of creating more space in our, society for people with disabilities of all kinds to access work and life as they need it, and meet people where they're at. So I agree with everything that you just said, Brian. And I think for me, like adaptability and access, like we don't have inclusion without those two things of people with disabilities.
Yeah. I want to add something to what both of you shared, because you triggered a thought of mine around the way people approach other people, where there's this issue of, I've seen, whether it's in a grocery store or in a corporate environment, one individual treating someone else's being statement space as an inconvenience for them. And I'm always very curious how that person expects to be appreciated or acknowledged on their own merits if they're not willing to give others the space to be appreciated on their merits and on their their dimensions of diversity. So there's regretfully so many who just expect, I don't know if it's literally being a narcissist, but expect everything to be on their terms and their way, but are unwilling to give others the space to be themselves. And part of being themselves, maybe they need a few minutes to process information. They need the space to have the quiet conversation. They need access in a different way from the way in which that particular person does. So why would anyone give those negative naysayers the space that they would like if they're unwilling to do so in return?
I heard, well, I'm a big Brene Brown fan. I probably have some other fans in the audience with us today. And I also just want to make a note before I come back to that point, is something that I do that I would encourage leaders to do is to listen to others that have different lived experiences than you, that have different points of view than you. So, watch Alicia's TEDx talk.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, we're going to do a plug for the TEDx talk. But if you're not living, a person living in a wheelchair, then you're going to learn something that you probably don't know today, and find other voices that are going to share stories with you. Brene, by the way, she and I tend to think a lot alike, but I still learn from her every time. And something, because I get frustrated with those humans that you just mentioned, Michael. Now, my job is to embrace all humans, and I do my best to do that, but I still get frustrated. I'm also just a human who has emotions as well. And something that Brene said in a podcast that I was listening to is that she was just reminding us that to do what you just described of creating access for everyone, to creating openness to those conversations and those connections, it takes energy, it takes work, it takes intention, it takes thoughtfulness, and sometimes people are lazy and they don't want to do it. If you're one of those people, I just encourage you to get up off the couch and try. And what I choose to do, though, is I don't spend time with the people that aren't interested in showing up for the conversation. I have to make a mental choice for myself, for my own sanity. And I also know that there's a lot of other humans who want to make the world a better place, who want to learn, who want to be part of the journey with me. I learn from them. Hopefully they learn from me. And so that's where I spend my time and energy.
I love that.
At least.
Yes. Sorry, I had to look off screen and get Alycia's TEDx. I don't think anyone's going to be able to type this in, but I will do my best to include it in LinkedIn. Yes. So we'll share that. Alycia, any parting words?
I just appreciate this hour. I appreciate you bringing disability to light, especially during this month. Any businesses out there that are watching this, I just encourage you to be open, and any employees that are going after the job, we need to understand, we need to hire, try, and see. And on the other side of the coin, you got to be willing to go for it every day. We meet each other in the middle. We make it work. Equity. What does each person need to get to the finish line together?
So true. Yeah, that's great. And Brian,
I love that equity. It's what does everyone need to get to the finish line together? I'm going to borrow that, and I'll make sure I give you credit, Alycia. I just want to echo what Alycia said. Is just thank you for the opportunity to share. I always learn from these conversations and leave hoping that I've added value in some way. Most importantly, I just appreciate the opportunity to share a bit of my story and believe that there's someone out there listening and watching who needed to just know that there's someone else like them. So thank you for giving space for that.
Love it.
Truly our pleasure. Thank you for sharing your voice and sharing your perspective and just being open to the conversation. It has been rewarding for me. I learn from every one of these conversations because I'm on my own DEI journey, and I want to grow. So thank you both for sharing your perspective and giving me a lot of food for thought, as well as our audience is giving you a lot of love right now. So thank you both. And we'll be following up very soon. Thank you for everyone on YouTube and LinkedIn, and we'll see you again next time. Be well. Bye-bye.